The year is 1981, and across the desert, you could hear the roar of the last of the V8 interceptors. Mad Max, the Road Warrior.
In the future, cities will become deserts. Roads will become battlefields. And the hope of mankind will appear as a stranger. He works alone against all odds. He may be the best chance we've got.
You want to get out of here? You talk to me.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Movie Punditry. This is Mike. How are you guys doing? And with the release of Furiosa, I decided to take a look at Mad Max 2, or as we call it in North America, The Road Warrior. This movie was released Christmas Eve, 1981 in Australia, and then it came out a few weeks later in North America. Directed, of course, by George Miller, starring, of course, Mel Gibson. So let's start by talking a little bit about George Miller. George Miller, obviously born in Australia. He was, believe it or not, he was a medical doctor. He worked in an emergency room in Sydney. While he was doing his residency, I guess, he took a summer film class and met a guy named Brian Kennedy who would become his producing partner up until the time that Kennedy died. They produced a student film or something along those lines, and it was noticed. And so George Miller began working on this idea for Mad Max, for the first Mad Max movie. And his basic conceit was that he wanted it to be a silent film with sound. Very little in the way of dialogue. And if you've seen the first Mad Max movie, it had almost no dialogue in it. It was going to be told visually, which it was. So it was picked up by Village Roadshow. And so we wound up with a guy named James McCaskill writing it, who was a journalist. And the reason for that was that he looked at some of the movies that he really liked in terms of their screenplays. And he realized that those screenwriters had all been journalists prior to becoming screenwriters. So he went out to look for a journalist who wanted to become a screenwriter, and he found McCaskill. And McCaskill started putting the story together. They sold it to Village Roadshow. Originally, the studio wanted an American actor, but they realized that it would be too much money, so they put out a casting call in Australia. Gibson had just graduated from the National Institute of Dramatic Arts in Australia. They put out a casting call for recent graduates, and Gibson was one of the ones who came in and read, and they liked him. Mad Max was only Gibson's second film. Mad Max was a moderate hit. It wound up getting itself banned in Sweden and New Zealand. It was given a U.S. release. It was released by a company called AIP, which became Filmways. But it was a dubbed version of the film. They didn't use Australian actors. They used American actors to overdub the dialogue in it. It was really, really limited release, and it was not anything that really made any waves. It did kind of put Miller on the map, though. Supposedly he says he was offered the chance to direct First Blood with Sylvester Stallone. He was also offered to direct some rock and roll film. But he figured that if he did a sequel to Mad Max in Australia, he'd be able to get more money for a budget because it was a somewhat known property, and the film had been fairly successful in Australia. So he was using a lot of influences from a lot of different sources when it comes to scripting this film. He looked specifically at some of the work of Carl Jung, at Kurosawa, the samurai films, that type of thing, and also the work of Joseph Campbell, specifically his idea of the monomyth or the hero's journey. Now, this is something that we've seen in countless stories, a variety of movies, including, of course, Star Wars. So the idea of the monomyth is that the hero in a story goes on this particular journey, and there are stages to this journey. The first stage being the call, sometimes a reluctant call to take action, to do something. And then there's the introduction of a mentor or a helper, or sometimes both. Then there's what Campbell called the abyss or death, which is the hero sinking into kind of a low place. And then there's the transformation, atonement, redemption, and then finally the return. And by return, I mean the hero starts off in a place of being known, a place where things are known to him. And as he moves into his journey, he goes into the unknown. But as he comes back around, he returns back to the known, or the unknown becomes known to him. And this is something, obviously, Star Wars, we see Lucas gave us a really clear example of this. You know, Luke is called by Ben Kenobi to join the cause, to finish Leia's mission. He's reluctant to do so, but he finally does do so. Ben, of course, is his mentor. He winds up with helpers in the person of Han Solo and Chewbacca. He goes through this adventure, and then, he winds up going through the abyss. When Ben dies, he goes into this kind of dark place, but then he is transformed by the experience and by his performance over the Death Star and the battle over the Death Star, where he now becomes the hero and he returns to this position where he's comfortable again. And that's kind of the journey that he takes. And as we go through this movie, we're going to see that Max kind of goes through this same type of process as we progress through the story. They did 12 weeks of filming in a town called Broken Hill, which is the western part of the state of New South Wales, in the southwestern part of Australia. They did it in winter. So even though, as we watch the film, it seems like it's out in the desert and things are hot, it was apparently freezing. One of the stories goes is that they were able to tell that it was getting too cold when Vernon Wells, whose character Wes is wearing buttless chaps, when his butt cheeks got purple. They knew they had to stop and warm everybody up. So I got a lot to talk about, so let's kind of jump into the movie, and we start with this great opening narration.
My life fades. The vision dims. All that remains are memories. I remember a time of chaos, ruined dreams, this wasted land. But most of all, I remember the road warrior, the man we called Max. To understand who he was, you have to go back to another time, when the world was powered by the black fuel, and the desert sprouted great cities of pipe and steel. Gone now, swept away. For reasons long forgotten, two mighty warrior tribes went to war and touched off a blaze which engulfed them all. Without fuel, they were nothing. They'd built a house of straw. The thundering machine sputtered and stopped.
And we hear about how there was a global war. We see that there's ecocide, the entire environment has been destroyed. We're not given any details about it. We're not told how widespread it is. We're not told whether other countries are really involved. I mean, he does mention that it's a global war, but he doesn't really go into the details of it. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. This is a small story. It's a really tight film. Running time on this thing is 96 minutes. That includes the credits. So there's not a wasted second in this film. And then we see the car. The Pursuit Special, which in this case is a Ford Falcon XPGT. And this really caters, this in the first film, really cater to Australia's car culture. Australia, especially in the 70s and 80s, really had a very deep car culture. Muscle cars, race cars, performance cars, building different modifications in the cars. This is really a huge thing. And this type of film really digs into that. The car in the first film, I believe it was a Holden, but this is a Ford, the XPGT, which is a really rare car. And this one's got the big honking supercharger on the front. It's a really cool car. And then we see Max Rockatanski, the hero the protagonist from the first film, a little bit older, little bit more world-worn, and we see him driving across the desert and with his Australian cattle dog. This dog apparently was a rescue. They found this dog in a pound. It was going to be put down, and so they rescued the dog, and the dog had no previous acting experience, but was a very smart dog apparently, and was able to be trained. And so you see this dog with Max, and it kind of winds up giving you this feeling. So there's this thing in storytelling and writing where you have a protagonist that is sometimes difficult to tell whether this is a good guy or a bad guy. So there's this thing in screenwriting called Save the Cat, which is basically you have your protagonist do something at the beginning of the film that either they do something heroic or they do something that's heartwarming, like saving a cat, and that's kind of codes them as being the good guy, even though the things that they may be doing right off the bat are not necessarily things that a good guy would do. So when we see Max and we see him with his dog and we like this relationship that he has with this dog, it kind of codes him as being the good guy in this film. And that's kind of important because they knew going in that a lot of people would not necessarily have seen the first film. The first film was popular in Australia, but it wasn't terribly popular in North America. It wasn't terribly popular in the rest of the world. And so they had to make the assumption that a lot of people that hopefully would be coming to this film hadn't seen Mad Max. And so they had to kind of reintroduce this character from jump because he might not necessarily have the baggage that we saw him have coming out of the first film. Like, people may not know his backstory or know that he lost his family or know what he went through as a police officer. And so we see Max, he's scavenging, obviously, for fuel. He's scavenging for food. And we get the first glimpse of the gang, which we will find out in a little bit is actually a pretty large gang of marauders. They catch him. He finds a wrecked car, which still has someone in it who is alive but dies almost immediately. And then we see Max, he's trying to get the fuel out of the car. He's using bowls and cups and whatever will basically hold a liquid to get as much of the gasoline as he can. And he sees the marauders coming down the road, and we are introduced to Wes. Wes is played, of course, by Vernon Wells. Wells is, he's pretty well known to action film fans in the 80s. You know, obviously he was in this. He was in Weird Science. He was Bennett in Commando. He was in a bunch of other things. He was a theater actor prior to this. I think this is actually his first film. The funny part is that apparently Vernon Wells is like the nicest, most soft-spoken guy you can possibly imagine. For some reason, George Miller saw something in him, but he came in and tested for it, and apparently they put him like kind of in the costume and shaved his head, and he basically turned into Wes, this psychotic, grunting, almost nonverbal character, and a legend was born. So Max is able to get away from the marauders, and we see that he's pretty talented at what he does. And then he comes across the crashed gyrocopter, which is a pretty cool gizmo. Not a lot of people have seen one of these. I remember being a kid, I'd never seen one of these things. I think I was in high school, but I was barely in high school when this came out. He comes up on it, he sees the snake, he's going to try to catch the snake. He gets trapped by the gyro captain, played by Bruce Spence. And that's kind of the interesting part about some of this is that some of these characters don't even really have names. I mean, yeah, we have Max and we have Wes and we have Papagallo and Rebecca and Nathan, Humongous. But then there's a bunch of characters in this that are basically, their character names are just descriptions. So we have characters like the gyro captain, the captain's girl, the golden youth, the toady, the feral kid, the warrior woman, the mechanic, the quiet man, the broken victim. These are the way these characters are credited, and some of them are fairly major characters in the story. You see those kind of credits sometimes for really minor characters, police officer number 2 or beautiful reporter or something like that. But the captain is ostensibly a secondary protagonist. He's certainly the helper role, the mentor helper role of Max when it comes to his position in the monomyth, but he's just the gyro captain. And just in case you were wondering, the character that he plays in Beyond Thunderdome, Jedediah, is not the same character. However, apparently they were looking for somebody like Bruce Spence to play Jedediah, and so they figured, why not just get Bruce Spence? But even though the characters are very similar, they are two different characters. And so here's where we get, I just want to talk a little bit about this idea of point of view that Miller is using in this film. Most of the story is being told from Max's point of view. And so you really only see the things that he sees for the most part. So this next sequence, when they're watching the Marauders who are attacking the car, you see it from Max's point of view, and he starts looking through the binoculars, and now you're looking through binoculars, and everything is pretty far away. And there's also this idea of subjective sound. So you can hear the people in the car yelling and screaming, but you can't really make out what it is that they're saying because Max is far away, and so it's not clear. Miller does this a couple of times in the film, and this is not something that you see a lot, and certainly something that a lesser filmmaker probably would not do, is this idea of, I'm going to have somebody talk, but you're not going to be able to hear him because he's so far away. They would just ADR it or put a mic on them and make sure that it was clear. But in this case, it's just kind of garbled and it's very far away, and Max is looking through these binoculars. And then you see the gyro captain. He comes out with this super long telescope, which Max takes from him, and now Max has a better point of view, and so do we as the audience. We have a better point of view as to what's going on there. Miller does this kind of throughout the film. He just puts everything in Max's point of view. Later on in the film, we're going to see when the Marauders are circling the refinery and Humongous is on his speaker and he's talking. Max is so far away you can't even really make out what it is that he's saying. And let's talk about Humongous for a moment. So this is Kjell Nilsson, Kjell. He is a Swedish weightlifter, also an actor. Kind of discount Arnold Schwarzenegger at this point in time. He's a very interesting character. You see obviously his massive muscles. You see the back of his head, his stringy hair, and his muscles kind of pulsing in his skull. You see his eyes, but you never see his face because he's wearing this Michael Myers hockey mask in front of his face. George Miller, in an interview, had said that he thought that Humongous was probably like an ex-military officer whose face had been scarred, and that he was in the same military unit as Papagallo, that these two actually knew each other outside of or prior to whatever this big apocalyptic thing is, which may lean into why Papagallo has this innate distrust of Humongous. Whereas you see other characters like Rebecca, or what they call the curmudgeon, the old guy in the kind of fake soldier outfit with the soldier helmet, who really decides that he's kind of trustworthy. There's this also this differentiation between the people in the refinery and the Marauders outside. The Marauders are all black leather and studs and metal. The costume designer apparently went to every S&M shop they could find and just bought a bunch of stuff, and that's what the Marauders are wearing. A lot of these guys are just locals. They're extras. They're minors, actually. When they put them in the costumes and shaved their heads and gave them the mohawks, apparently these guys were kind of angry with it at first, but they grew to like it after the fact. So a lot of those guys that you're seeing as the Marauders are just basically locals from this part of Australia, and they're just stepping in to do this. But so this is what the Marauders are wearing. They're wearing all this black leather and studs and chaps and mohawks and all this stuff, whereas the people in the refinery are wearing cloth, white, gray, off-white, dirty white, linen, and it's a very clear differentiation between these two factions in this movie. And it's interesting to note that Max is dressed more like the Marauders than the quote-unquote good people in the refinery. And this kind of shows his ambiguity. One thing we didn't talk about, we were talking about point of view, but one thing I don't think that we mentioned is, according to Miller, these movies, the 3 films that feature Max after the original Mad Max, all in all are told by different characters. They're kind of the point of view of different characters in the movie when their lives intersect with Max's. This movie is clearly told by the feral kid when the feral kid grows up. We get a monologue at the end that shows that, he stayed with the tribe and eventually became their leader.
And so began the journey north to safety, to our place in the sun. Among us we found a new leader, the man who came from the sky, the gyro captain. And just as Pappagallo had planned, we travelled far beyond the reach of men and machines. The juice, the precious juice, was hidden in the vehicles. As for me, I grew to manhood. In the fullness of time, I became the leader, the chief of the great northern tribe. And the road warrior, that was the last we ever saw of him. He lives now, only in my memories.
And so we find out that, he was also the opening monologue, and the whole story is basically told from his point of view. In Beyond Thunderdome, it's Savannah, who is the oldest girl in the tribe who left, and she's, at the end of the movie, she's telling the story about Max and how they, just continuing to tell the tale and light the lights so that, Max may come back to them. And in Fury Road, I don't think it's as clear, but maybe it's Furiosa, I think it's probably one of the brides. But this can explain why Max is really so different in each of the films. It's because it's told from somebody's point of view, and everybody's going to have a different perspective. About the refinery itself, this was an actual practical set that was built mostly from scrap metal from local junkyards and things like that. So this is not, a lot of times you see these things in movies and it's painted plywood, or maybe plywood with just like a veneer or, thin metal or something, or plastic on the front. This is actually heavy metal, real tanks, real girders, real structure that they built for this movie. You wind up with Wes inside the refinery, running around. As great stunt work, great acting on Vernon Wells' part. He says the line, "You can run, but you can't hide," which at this point, it's something that's attributed to Joe Louis that he had said, but this may be the first time that it's been in a movie. Obviously, it's kind of a cliche now. You have Pappagallo's speech when he's trying to convince the people to fight and make their escape and not turn the refinery over to Humongous and the Marauders because he doesn't trust them, and he's getting a lot of pushback.
But remember one thing, that is more than just a tanker of gas. That is our lifeline to a place beyond that vermin on machines.
That's 2,000 miles from here. How do you expect us to get it there? Drag it?
If we have to, yes, there's always a way. But the first step, defend the fuel.
Which leads to, obviously, Max making his quote-unquote offer to them.
2 days ago, I saw a vehicle that'd haul that tanker. You want to get out of here? You talk to me.
And now you're off into the third act of the movie. You have this cool, sequence with the gyro captain, which gives Miller the opportunity to shoot aerial shots. Otherwise, why would he be shooting aerial shots if there wasn't an aircraft around? So it's a great little kind of distraction. Before that, Max goes out, gets the rig, brings it back, and I really love the this kind of back and forth between Pappagallo and the mechanic through the mechanic's assistant Zeta, where they're doing this kind of, back and forth thing.
How's the rig? The rig! How is she? Got a cracked timing case cover and it's broken a couple of teeth off the timing gears.
Got a cracked timing case cover, it's broken a couple of teeth off the timing gear.
The radiator's damaged at the core.
The radiator's damaged at the core.
Got a cracked water pump.
It's got a cracked water pump.
And a fractured injector line.
It's got a fractured injector line.
Well, what does all that mean?
Yeah, okay, but what does that mean? What does that mean?
24 hours.
24 hours?
They've got 12.
You've got 12! Okay.
So here's the question, is like, when does Papagallo know that the tanker is going to be a decoy? Does he know it at this point? Is that been the plan all along? And if doing that and trying to convince Max to drive the tanker, what does that say about him? Although I will point out that he was initially going to do it himself, but instead, you know, he finds that Max can do it and kind of talks him into it, gives him the whole "we've all lost somebody" speech. And it just kind of shows, I think, that, you know, he's one of these guys who's willing to kind of do whatever he's got to do in order to do what he considers to be the greater good. So you have these two parallels, if you will. You've got Max and Wes, I think, who are kind of both on the, you know, they're kind of the underling, but they're kind of both just driven out of anger and revenge. But you also have Humongous and Papagallo, who I would also argue is kind of two sides of the same coin, and both adept at manipulating and using people in order to achieve what it is that they're looking to achieve. I just want to point out that every attack, every fight, everything is just really tight, really well scripted, really well blocked out. There's not a wasted frame of film in here. They have the truck escape, the cars go out the other way, Max has got the guys chasing him, you have this cool battle. You have the mechanic, you have the warrior woman, they're on the truck. Do they know it's a decoy? I'm assuming they do, and that they're just willing to make that sacrifice. Max obviously doesn't know, because once the tanker overturns and the sand starts pouring out of it, you see him, you know, put his hand out and look kind of suspiciously at it, and he almost smiles. Actually, he does smile. This is kind of, you know, he smiles a little bit with the music box and the kid, but this is actually kind of a smile where I think he's come really fully around at this point, and he's accepted the sacrifice that he made. That explosion of the refinery, by the way, that was so big, they had to get the Australian Army in to do it, because they couldn't buy the kind of explosives they needed commercially, and they had to get military munitions to come in there and rig the place to blow. So that huge explosion was done courtesy of the Australian Army. And then, as I said before, we have that end narration, and we move on, and that's the end of the story. And at this point, we don't know what happens to Max. You know, this movie is just really has a lot of influence over films that came. I mean, a lot of stuff, someone who's never seen this film, who's looking at this film in 2024, maybe watching it before they watch Furiosa or something, and a lot of this stuff looks kind of tropey, and, oh, I've seen that before. You hadn't seen this before when this film came out. This kind of post-apocalyptic wasteland film, it had been done before, but always had what a science fiction bend to it. The idea that this is really kind of speculative, but we're seeing this kind of vision in 1981 is really creative, and probably the first time something like this has been on film. Like I said, you have the Planet of the Apes, A Boy and His Dog, you have other films, but they're always had some kind of a sci-fi bend to them. This is just straight up like, this could just happen. This is just what happens when people are people. Also, this idea of non-stop action, just quick cuts, taking you on a ride for 90 minutes of not letting up and not going. If you look at films of the 70s, they tend to be very slow-paced, methodical. Yeah, they'll have action sequences in them, and I'm not saying they don't. You know, have movies like Bullet and stuff that obviously have great action sequences in them, but for the most part, they tend to be a little more plodding along and a little more paced out. This is just boom, 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 which was something that was very unusual at the time that this came out, and probably the biggest influence that this movie, or legacy that this movie has, is Mel Gibson. Maybe not exactly this film, but certainly the Mad Max franchise. But by the time he gets to this, he had just done Gallipoli, which would go on to win, in the Australian Film Awards, would win Best Film, Best Director, Best Screenplay, and Gibson would win Best Actor. The next film he would do after this is The Year of Living Dangerously, which, of course, Linda Hunt would win an Oscar for. Mel Gibson would get nominated for Best Actor again for that film. So he's got kind of the streak going on here. For this film, he got nominated for Saturn Award for Best Actor. And in the Australian Film Awards for that year, the film would win Best Director, Best Editing, Best Production Design, Best Sound and Costume Design, and get nominated for Cinematography and Music. By the way, the Brian May who composed the music for this film, not Brian May from Queen. Gibson goes off and does a couple more films, and then in 85 he does Beyond Thunderdome. In 87 he does Lethal Weapon, and then that's it. The horse is out of the barn at that point. So this film had a budget of about 4 million Australian dollars. I don't know what the exchange rate was in 1984. Today that's a little over $3 million. It did wind up making $36 million worldwide. That's US dollars, so that's a pretty good return on the investment. And then this thing went crazy in the video rental market, and then eventually, the cable TV and network TV. It's got a 93 on Rotten Tomatoes, 77 on Metacritic. Roger Ebert, 3.5 stars. So Roger liked this one. So this is Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you next time. Don't forget, we've got Green and Black coming up. We got a second season of House of the Dragon, so Justin and I will be working on that. We got the main show, the Movie Punditry Show, coming up. So thanks for listening, and we will catch you next time.